exciting and interesting volume. And it's exciting because of not just its relevance to Portugal, which is important and which, may I suggest, you as specialists will know that, you hardly need me to comment on that, but also because of its broader relevance to a number of constituencies. First, the constituency of European history as a whole, by which I don't just mean military history, I mean European history in its broader sense, because what this volume does is help to provide a location of military history in the broader pattern of history of that period, and to address anew the significance which has taken part, been brought to the fore by a number of theorists. One can think of Charles Tilly, for example, about the relationship between the military and the development of the state. I mean, in the case of Portugal, there is the added complication, the interesting complication, that the state in question is Portugal, but also part of the time Portugal as part of the larger Habsburg or Spanish Habsburg conglomeration. So there is really the relationship between war and two states there, or two state developments, two state trajectories that is of interest. So that element, I think, is very, very important. And I hope the book receives sufficient attention from people who are not primarily military historians, and that, I think, is a challenge to make sure it comes to their attention. Then secondly, obviously, we have the question about its significance in terms of European military history. And there, I suppose, what one's got is, again, a number of elements conceptually, methodologically, and historiographically. Conceptually, there is the way in which the military revolution is debated. There are a number of different viewpoints on that. I am not going to use the privilege of being invited by a speaker to speak in order to sort of, as it were, try and argue my case, because there are other people who've got different points of view, and their points of view are worth listening to. What I want to say, though, is that it contributes to an understanding of military developments in that period, and indeed circumstances in that period, as being multifaceted. And therefore, it puts a question mark against any one theory, whichever form that theory takes. And I think that's an interesting point of view, because what it does is it exemplifies the multiplicity of circumstances within Europe. So you mentioned in your introduction Lorraine White, for example. Lorraine White did excellent work discussing the very specific relationship between as it were, the environment of the Hispano-Portuguese borderlands and their consequences for the nature of conflict there, the consequences in particular for campaigning in the summer, the need to put an emphasis on cavalry that might be able to move quicker in terms of dealing with that environment, in that environmental context. And in doing so, what she was doing brilliantly was not just throwing attention on a very interesting topic, but also exemplifying the point that there wasn't some sort of simple contrast between a Western Europe, which was strongly dominated by infantry, and an Eastern Europe, which was much more clearly cavalry. And she was saying, well, actually, we can problematize that. Another area, of course, where the problematization is very clear is the extraordinary importance. I mean, you're sitting in Évora, which again, I agree with what Chris says. I was fortunate enough to be there in 1991, so that's some years ago, and 1990, so some years ago. But as you will know, if you go to that part of the world, you will see very significant fortifications. So these are fortifications which reflect, I mean, they're discussed in the Christopher Duffy General History on Fortification in that period, but on the whole, I think it's fair to say that the role of fortification in the pre-Vauban period, before the expenditure that was pushed through in Vauban, and outside the area that was talked about when people focus on Vauban, the Low Countries, France's borders, northern Italy, has not always been as significant or received as much attention as it should. And again, your volume helps to address that, to show the multiplicity there. So part of the significance is not just the importance of Portugal, but arguing for a different conceptualization in early modern military history, in which applied and significant research by active scholars shows the need not to assume that there is one model, however we wish to characterize it, which diffuses from a particular paradigm, however we wish to characterize it, and then is spread or adopted accordingly. Instead, I think what I would argue is that in a sense, what we have is an exemplification of what I would think should always be expected, which is fitness for purpose. You develop military practices that are fit for the purpose of the particular tasking, circumstances, and context of a given area. And that was very much seen in these very long conflicts between Portugal and first Castile, and then obviously subsequently Spain as a whole. And then we move, I think, to the broader question, which is Portugal's role in the world. And I think it's very clear that the extent to which, I mean, nobody is trying to downplay the significance of the Spanish activities, but the longevity of Portugal's military complications, commitments, entanglements, difficulties, and successes in a variety of African environments. Africa is an enormous continent. In a variety of African environments, in a variety of Indian Ocean environments, and indeed, of course, in a variety of sort of trans-Atlantic environments, because Brazil is certainly not one military environment. All of these points, again, exemplify the challenges posed to Portugal by its imperial activity. And that, again, provides us with a way of arguing that Portugal is particularly significant. And as you know, there is a tendency, a number of scholars have looked at the way in which Portugal is still an important power in the 17th and 18th century, but there is a tendency to downplay its significance in general military terms in that period. And I think that that is not helpful. I mean, you know, one is still a significant power, even if one is not the top power, however you define the top power. I mean, you know, you might argue that the top power in the 17th century is Manchu China. But, you know, so however you define the top power is a matter of opinion. The point is that that Portugal is still actively engaging in military tasks, sometimes successfully. That tremendous success of regaining the initiative against the Dutch in northern Brazil, in Angola, in West Africa, the role in which the Portuguese are still having to play in fighting powers in South Asia, for example, in West India in the late 1730s, defending Goa, for example, against attack. All of these mean that Portuguese military history should not be treated as a detachable point which ceases to be significant after 1580, or is only significant in ephemeral or limited circumstances. So I congratulate you in putting it forward. What I would urge you to do, you're young scholars in a very competitive job environment, which is very difficult. What I would urge you to do, and some of you will be able to follow careers in formal education, and some of you won't, and that's the nature of things. What I would urge you to do in all circumstances is to try and reach out to broader audiences in order to argue the significance of Portuguese examples and Portuguese paradigms for more general themes. That doesn't lessen your being scholars of Portugal. What it does is put Portugal where it deserves to be, which is an important aspect of the multifaceted, multipolar nature of the European Atlantic world. Now, I hope I haven't taken up too much of people's time. There we go. Over to Chris.
Okay. Well, thanks. And to some extent, Jeremy's stolen some of my thunder.
I'm sorry, Chris.
No, it's fine. I shall try not to repeat him. And some of what I'm saying is going to be echoing. But look, first of all, I'd like to thank you all for inviting me to take part in your book launch today, even if I'm only virtually in Évora, a wonderful place. But look, just some sort of preliminary remarks. And again, here I am echoing Jeremy. Portugal is one of the earliest and longest lived empires, right? It's not collapsed really until the 1970s. And yet, especially for the English speaking world, we just don't know enough about it for all sorts of reasons. Now, until relatively recently, if I wanted to assign some reading to my students, I would be very dependent on that fine old work by that fine old historian Charles Boxer on the Portuguese seaborne empire. Now, in recent decades, things have improved. We've got the work of Bethencourt and Ramado Cortu, although there's not very much in there on the military. We've got Gabe Paquette's recent book. There's A.J.R. Russell Wood. And thinking about a later century, we've got Ken Maxwell's work on Pombal and the Portuguese Atlantic. But still, there is scope for a lot more work. And so here we have a group of young, mainly Portuguese historians. Jeremy referred there to Lorraine. I don't think she's Portuguese.
No, she isn't.
But we have this group of young Portuguese historians making available in English. And I think Jeremy makes a very good point there about reaching this English speaking, because it's not just English, it's all those Americans who are reading these English language works, and bringing to this wider audience some really interesting research findings which are going to enlarge our understanding, our knowledge and understanding of Portuguese imperial history. Now, I think we're all familiar with the military revolution, so we don't need to explain what that is, except just to sort of, I suppose, make the point we have astonishing how difficult it sometimes is to get hold of the initial work. Michael Roberts' lecture, most easily accessible, I suppose, in the Cliff Rogers collection of essays on the subject. But then, of course, we have Geoffrey Parker, who took issue with some aspects of the original Roberts formulation, but also took it in that wholly new direction, which is why so many of us engage these days with Parker rather than Roberts, because Parker makes it the foundation for this notion of the rise of the West. And then, of course, Jeremy will blush, but Jeremy is probably the leading critic of the whole notion of the military revolution in terms of its chronology. The whole idea of the rise of the West being founded on the military revolution, and then of course the relationship, the timing of the relationship between the military, state, and society. Now, despite Jeremy's strictures, the military revolution remains a widely used, if debated and even dismissed, explanatory framework which people are still engaging with, as indeed are the three of you and your collaborators. Okay, so Portugal is largely omitted from the military revolution. I've been looking at the index of a few books in the past few days, and it's astonishing, or should I say shocking, how few references there are to Portugal in some of them. So I take one example, Brian Downing's book on the military revolution and political change, right? It discusses Britain, France, Poland, right, but not Portugal. So that's quite surprising. Now the essays, thinking about what's in the book now, the essays range very widely in terms of both geography and of topics or themes. So we get European Portugal, we have Africa, more specifically Morocco and Angola, and we have the East. So that's a wide geographical coverage. And we've also got a wide range of topics. So we have fortresses and gunpowder, engineers, and so on. And so they are clearly among the strengths of the collection. Another of the things that I really like about it is the way you draw on and you make clear to your readers the existence of what is a very rich archival base for good work on early modern Portugal. So we've got the Arquivo de Torre de Tombo and other sources. And so you're making clear to potential researchers that there is a wonderful tranche of material. I'm not sure if it rivals Simancas in its wealth, but clearly there is a great deal of material to go on. And then thinking about what you've drawn on and the areas you've covered, you offer, it seems to me, some invaluable new material by way of data to underpin our assessment of the whole debate, the contributions to the debate about the military revolution, but also I think you enhance and nuance some of the theoretical conceptual approaches. And I think these are all invaluable things that you've done. So you filled a gap, but I think you've done more than that. Not all gaps need to be filled, as all historians, I think, know, but you have done that and you've added to our understanding. It's now clear, for example, that the Portuguese arrival in the East, but not only in the East, in some respects echoed the experience of the Spaniards in the Americas. It wasn't a simple conquest. They arrived at a situation where they needed allies, for example, in order, native allies, to ensure success. So now our understanding of, say, the Spanish experience in the Americas is a little bit more nuanced and contextualized. It's not quite so extraordinary or unusual, even given the revisionism that has been applied to the Spanish experience. And I think that one of the things that we must hope for is that your work is going to feed into, is going to be taken up by those who are going to be writing the big syntheses of the future, particularly in the English-speaking world. But I'd like to say a few things about how we build on, or what you have here, how we build on your achievement. Now, again, I want to embarrass Jeremy. Jeremy has drawn attention to a whole array of influences and factors which we need to be aware of in terms of influencing or shaping military performance and, above all, success in battle, in campaign more broadly, in war, but also in peacetime. And I just want to identify a few of these other influences which we need to be aware of, thinking about the military revolution. Leadership qualities, right? We don't have enough work on, say, military leadership. There's obviously the work of Lunt on generals, but I think we need more about individuals in that respect, their mindsets. Diplomacy, very, very important. I think it's fair to say that Portugal would not have succeeded in the War of Restoration if it hadn't have been for the workings of its very fine diplomatic network across Europe. It seems that's very important. Intelligence and maps. Now, there are references to these in the essays, in the collection. And I know Jeremy is a great fan of maps, but these are very, very important. As in intelligence, it seems to me that if you're short of manpower, weapons, etc., you really need to know, where to make your effort and know where the enemy is making his to deploy scarce resources. Another issue, I think, or factor or aspect we need to be thinking about, medicine. Now, medicine's really important. And I think given the pandemic, there's going to be a lot more money available for research in plague and medicine in history. So if you're thinking of where you might like to go next, think about a medicine and warfare project. because it's important in all sorts of respects. Another area we ought to be thinking about, I think, is why men fought. This is a very difficult one to get at, but actually it's quite important in ensuring the success or failure of the recruiting sergeant before each campaign. And there's some interesting work done on this, which you might think about drawing on. Provision and supply raise the whole issue of contracting. And there's some very interesting work done by people like Rafa Torres on contracting in the Spanish armies. And you might think about exploring some of these issues for the Portuguese armed forces. Moving into that private sector, privateers. We haven't touched very much on the war at sea, but this is a very important issue, that maritime warfare. Parker's the one who, if you like, supplements Robert's work with saying, well, what about the war at sea? And that's a very complex operation, and privateers are important, as is the arms industry. Again, a couple of the essays in the collection touch on the arms industry, but this is a really interesting topic I think we don't know enough about. Maybe the Hague as a great center of the international arms trade. And broadly, I think we just need much more data on so many aspects of the Portuguese war effort. And we can categorize it as an exemplary small state, although it's a curious state. It's sui generis, as it were, a small European state with a very big empire. And that's very, very odd. I suppose the Dutch Republic might sort of echo it.
Denmark also. Denmark.
Sorry? Yes, absolutely. But in many respects, it might bear comparison with some other smaller states. And in the collection, I think you do refer to Piedmont or the Kingdom of Sardinia. Somewhere in there, there's a reference. And I think that would be really interesting to follow up. And related to that, it'd be really interesting to know what foreign diplomats make of Portugal and its power, its armed might. So, for example, there's a project to marry off the Duke of Savoy to the Infanta of Portugal in about 1680. It doesn't come off, but it would be really interesting to know how they're assessing Portugal. The future French foreign minister, Colbert de Torcy, he visited Portugal, I think, in the 1680s, and he wrote a report about it. So again, that would be interesting, that foreign reaction to Portuguese power and its potential. And I think that in pursuing the global, we shouldn't lose sight of Portugal itself. And I think very interesting here is the work of Rafael Valladares, who's done some really interesting work. And I think he tries to argue this. On fortifications, there was, I think, a remarkable network of fortification, defensive structures, all the way along the land border with Castile and along Portugal's coastline. Among my favorites are Valença do Minho and the tiny town village of Monção in the Minho. And I just think there's a wonderful project here, echoing something like Geoffrey Parker walking along the Spanish road from Milan to Flanders to just plot all those fortifications and, I don't know, do something bigger with it, how it feeds into, for example, the fiscal military state. What proportion of the military budget is being absorbed each year by these very, very extensive and, I imagine, costly fortifications? This is surely one of the best collections of up-to-date fortifications in Southern Europe in its day. It's an astonishing collection. Okay, I think we also need to be thinking about the big conceptual foundations here. It's no news to anybody that to describe something happening over 300 years as a revolution is a bit difficult to get away with, I think. the rise of the West is also rather difficult. What actually do we mean by the West? I think we have an idea about a limited number of countries. Do we mean the same countries throughout the period? It may be that there are certain periods within which that triumph or influence of the West is more obvious in areas outside what we think of as the West than at others. So I think we need to think about the geography, both within and outside Europe, but also the chronology. But one of the issues when I was thinking about this military revolution and so on was, why has the concept proved so enduring, not least given the way Jeremy keeps bashing away at it, right? Despite all his arguments, he has not actually got rid of it. And that's an interesting question. Concepts come and go, debates become fashionable, one side wins, one thinks of the rise of the gentry, and another side doesn't. And yet this military revolution one persists. Does it still serve a purpose? Does it still have a function? And this seems to me to become more relevant as a question, because we now have some other concepts, appropriate concepts, to play around with. So I'm thinking now of the way David Parrott has put into play a new approach to the whole question with his Business of War of 2012, which suggests, I think, a new time frame for relationship between military change and the state and the private sector. But also, I think it's interesting, given the book we're thinking about, David doesn't really address the issue. He's not particularly interested in the global issue, I think. So I hope there are some interesting things for people to mull over, not only our authors, but also our audience. But I want to close by repeating my opening remarks and applauding what is an impressive collection of essays on early modern Portugal and its imperial past. So you're offering us insight also into what I think is a vibrant Portuguese community of historians. And that is a really interesting thing. I don't think the world outside Portugal is aware of its history, but also of the fact there is a homegrown community of research historians who are doing some very fine work. So congratulations, and thank you again for inviting me along today. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Christopher Storrs, and thank you very much, Professor Jeremy Black, for both your presentations. In fact, there are many avenues of research. There is much to do, and both your presentations definitely contributed to that, to a debate which is in some of these topics still starting and has a lot of way to make. So now let's perhaps open the room for some questions or some comments by our audience. So remember, if you want to ask a question, you can always use the chat room and it will be provided the permission to speak. So now to the audience, please. Questions?
For any comment, it doesn't need to be a specific question, of course.
Exactly. Yes. Oh, I believe Fernando Costa has a question. Can we please? Yes. Okay. I'm not sure if we can hear.
I can't hear, I'm afraid.
Exactly.
No, I can't either.
Sorry.
It's okay. Me neither. Fernando, can you please speak? We cannot hear you.
Just confirm if you have.
His mic is on.
The mic is on, but probably on the setup, you need to choose the set, the micro set.
Okay, let's see. Okay. Well, perhaps if we would like to ask if you, by any technical issue, you cannot speak, perhaps you can write a question at the chat room and then we'll try to provide an answer. More questions, please.
Zoltán has his hand up.
Oh yeah, okay. Zoltán, please.
I'll jump in here. First, to congratulate the editors and the authors, of course, of the individual pieces, and just to express my excitement at this publication. It's fantastic. I think Chris really put his finger on it by saying that there's this really vibrant research community in Portugal that people are not aware of internationally as much as they should. And I think, the fact that we are a relatively small group today in the room, which is of course a pity, probably, people are still stuck in traffic and all that sort of thing Friday evening, but it attests not so much to the provincialism of Portuguese history, which is really not about, it's really more about the provincialism of the international community, which doesn't pay enough, pay enough attention, right?
Absolutely.
Good point.
Good point.
So still, it's quite wonderful, and I think just the fact of having Jeremy and Chris in the room today is in itself proof that you are going somewhere, that we're all going somewhere. I mean, I have many questions, but the first thing that I would sort of like to challenge people to do, and I'm really sorry that Fernando went offline, because he asked that question: was there a military revolution in Portugal? In his article title, I haven't read the volume yet, so I wanted to challenge him to to answer that question in less than a minute. Was there a military revolution or not? Obviously, the answer is complex, but which way are we going? Are we tending to say yes, but no, but what? And since he may not be able to respond, I would also like to challenge the editors or the other authors. I see Tristan is in the room, to say something about this whole matter of was there not, regarding Asia in particular, because that is of course something that really complicates the story, because we're talking about something that we often consider or treat as a European empire, but that I think Portuguese historiography has shown is also an Asian empire, an Asian polity of sorts. Plus it's got that incredible complexity around the maritime and the terrestrial, which I think appears in a number of the articles. So again, it's probably mission impossible to respond to this, to sum it up in a minute or two, but I would like to challenge at least one or two of the authors and or editors of the volume to maybe clarify here. And again, congratulations and many thanks for organizing this. I'm really excited about reading the volume, and also I think I may be able to get a review of the volume by Chris for the Journal of Early Modern History. I very much hope we can have that, and that would be a way of putting it out there to the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zoltán. Well, it's in fact an interesting question. Shall we join another question to this one, if there is any other question or comment, in order to reply to all? Any more questions? Margarida, Roger, please. Yes.
Hello, good afternoon. First of all, I would like to thank the editors for this invitation and for this opportunity to compare and to face our work with others. My question is about the relationship between the built fortification and the army movements. I find this is very hard to articulate the historiography from military history and from architectural history, from military architectural history. I would like to know the feeling, the opinion of the Professor Black and the Professor Storrs about that connection that is obvious, that is natural between the warfare and the building of fortification. But I found sometimes very hard to find good work that connects both the aspects. And thank you.
Might I make one or two suggestions? Could
yes, please.
Well, I think that's a really fascinating point. Can I say that when we're looking at fortifications, I think all of us, including myself, are apt to focus on one group rather than the other. The second group is also worth thinking about, and that's the naval arsenals and the key element of fortification of ports. And of course, in the case of Portugal, this is particularly significant because the Tagus was probably the most significant strategic anchorage in Atlantic world, because it not only is the anchorage for Portugal, which of course is the first of the great maritime empires, it also becomes a key anchorage for the British, both in terms of the Royal Navy, but also in terms of their mercantile shipping. And of course, it has to be protected. I mean, as you will know, you don't need me to talk to you about this. I mean, the English had attempted to attack the Tagus, the Spaniards had landed in the Tagus. I mean, one of our great problems is we always think of fortifications. The British are just as bad. They never tend to think of fortifications of Portsmouth or Plymouth as the prime areas that really had to be fortified when one's looking at it. Now, as terms of the army as opposed to the navy, and I think, you know, when you're looking there, one of the great problems of fortifications, of course, has always been, is to the present day, that it does soak up troops. It really does soak up troops. And if you look at the garrison, the aggregate garrison size, it is striking how much. I mean, the period I know about is the 18th century. I'm very happy to be told I'm totally wrong for other periods. But if you look for the 18th century, it is striking how many troops are often tied down in defending fortifications. Well, that may appear anachronistic and foolish, but looked at more positively, since fortifications are usually the crucial logistical lodestars, nodal points in any system, what you're actually doing is guaranteeing your logistical system. And once you tend to think in those terms, if you then did a comparison with, let us say, now in a very different technological context, but if you did a comparison with, say, the United States today, you would find that in terms of, as it were, combat units as a percentage of the armed forces, the Americans currently do much worse, if you wish to use a judgmental term, I'm not sure that's helpful, but let's use that term, do much worse than 18th century armies. So that yes, fortifications reduce the, as it were, or can reduce the offensive strength in terms of combat units in the field, but on the other hand, they can guarantee their support system, and that I would say is strategically very, very important. And the last point I would make here is this. What fortification gives you is strength in being. You don't have to, if you've got reasonable fortifications, and the Portuguese certainly had very good fortifications in terms of the tasking that they were going to face from invasion from Spain. If you have fortifications, you can choose whether you wish to engage in battle or not. You force a strategic dilemma, and certainly on your opponent. Should that opponent concentrate on trying to force you to battle, or in trying to gain territory through siege, and with all the classic problems of concentration as opposed to dispersion? And to that viewpoint, I would say that investing in fortifications, despite being, and Chris is absolutely right here, despite being expensive, both in money and in manpower, also though gives you a tremendous strategic advantage, which is lost if you only have an army that is adequate for battle.
Could I just add something there? Jeremy's absolutely right, and I would echo everything he said. It's one of the reasons why there's often what appears an enormous difference between a state's army and its field army, the number of troops it can actually put into the field for any campaign, that so many of its armed forces have got to be assigned to garrison work. It would be interesting to know, for example, thinking about my favorite Valença do Minho, when if you look at, say, the War of 1762, what was the distribution of the Portuguese army between places like Valença, Elvas, Estremoz, Chaves, and the field army? I just don't know. An interesting project for one of you.
Well, I'm pretty sure that Fernando Dores Costa have the answer for that, as his works are fundamental. It's his fundamental work. It's precisely about the Army of Restoration. But yes, I totally agree. Should we perhaps now speak a little bit about Zoltán's question about, which is, of course, the question also raised by Fernando Dores Costa, was there a military revolution? I invite either Professor Black or Professor Storrs or my colleague co-authors to participate. Yes,
co-authors. Let's hear from your co-authors, because
yes, of course. I would like to say something, but first, please. Yes.
Well, yes. In response to Zoltán, I can say, well, the question was there a military revolution in Portugal? I think from the all articles that we got in the book, you can either say yes, you can either say no, you can either say maybe. It depends. Okay, so there are many definitions. I think Professor Christopher Storrs has mentioned that the longevity of the military revolution thesis. The longevity of the thesis. I think one of the main reasons behind it is because the concept is so flexible, it's so plastic. Basically, anyone can make his own military revolution. Okay, there are so many military revolutions in the last decades, but that also makes it very difficult to a lot of people to agree, to a set of historians to agree on what its precise form of that military revolution is. I know, for instance, that the three editors of the book do not agree on that exactly. So we did not want to make a volume which wanted to present a thesis, a question that said either yes or no to it. We were very clear about the contributors. Just state whatever you want, what your opinion is about this, okay? Because I find probably the most interesting thing about the military revolution thesis, whether you agree with it or not, is it is a very good basis for a conversation, a very good way to start a historiographical conversation that transcends borders. Because we've mentioned in this discussion that how confined Portuguese historiography is, that how little people know about the Portuguese historiography outside. I think one of the useful things about the military revolution is a way to attract, to draw other people's attention, I think the collection is also, the volume is also interesting in it brings together a group of Portuguese historians also, but it's also a smaller but also significant group of foreign non-Portuguese scholars, and we all talked, and we all have things to say. We all have different questions to that question that Zoltán asked, and that's all I have to say about it. Okay. I don't know if Zoltán's satisfied with my answer. Okay.
Okay. Well, thank you, André. I generally agree with him. And in fact, there are also a lot of spaces of observation, as it was already mentioned here. We have not only European space, but also we have Africa, we have Asia, we have Brazil. So all of these are many contexts and many different periods in history, many geographies, and of course that also difficult, strong, round, decisive answer to this question, which is immense. I'm not sure if Roger wants to say something. Roger,
Well,
please.
of course, I agree with everything that André said. The idea was precisely using the military revolution to speak about the Portuguese case. And what we can say is that, as a matter of fact, well, the idea of the military revolution, as Roberts and of course as Parker has put it, as always the idea of the military need. So as you need to develop, new firepower, you need also to develop new fortifications and everything else. And so the issue here is that as Portugal doesn't has any kind of great military action on this main field, on its main territory in Europe. So it needs, of course, to export, we can say, war to the empire. And so it's a very interesting idea to see if as Portugal need to develop new warfare institutions, if it develops it in the empire, but not in Portugal, here in Europe. And so I think it's really something that put us to think about all these possibilities. And so from Brazil to Africa to Asia, I'm not sure we've quite answer it. As André said, after reading the book, you can say yes, no, or maybe. And so probably it was the best way to try to frame the Portuguese case, which until now was kind of a blank page about the military revolution. And so it was really, really the main idea. And so maybe now Fernando Costa.
A comment on that. I think you're absolutely right that it is very useful to have a concept, and I think your previous gentleman's comment that it's very significant by way of having a conversation is important. There are a number of difficulties I have. I mean, I'm not just, you can read what I have to say. There's no point in my repeating it, but it's not just the specifics that bother me. It's also just a more interesting thing that has concerned me a little bit more of late, which is that in many other branches of history, we are not still endowing theories that were essentially advanced, in the case of Michael Roberts, over a half century ago, as our basic intellectual models. And this may be because of the characteristic nature of military history, which is that so much of it is action orientated or operationally concerned of, and that it tends to be an under-theorized branch of study. And therefore, I can't help wondering, I mean, you're, well, let's be realistic, your younger generation, you're going to be around when I'm dead or suffering from dementia. Your generation, it seems to me, whether you agree or not, really ought to be thinking about how to develop a new conceptualization, a new language for a subject, because you can't really be envisaging seriously that in 20 years' time, you are still going to be using a theory that is so old. And we could take that a stage further. Revolution itself as a concept, where it is still used, has been totally often stood on its head. So if you take the British understanding of the Industrial Revolution, when I was a kid, when I was a student, the Industrial Revolution was very much a production-driven model. It was all about coal and James Watt and developments in productive capability and using the factors of production differently. For about 25 years now, that's been all thrown aside, and instead of which it's a consumerist account of the Industrial Revolution that is to the fore. It's all about why is it that, as it were, there is the demand, the money, the interest in seeking particular goods and services that encourage people to try and break through productive constraints. So it's a very different account, even if the same word, industrial revolution, might be used by some people. Some people use a different word, different term. And I would say that that is really where we're at now, that the actual notions that went in with the original term reflected ideas of sociological development that were very strong in liberal circles, Marxist liberal circles, which were essentially Western centric in the third quarter of the 20th century into the 1980s. I think at the time they were only a partial account, but now I think, you know, you've got very different sort of ideas circulating. Chris has already referred to David Parrott's notions. I so happen to think David's a very good scholar. But the point is that what David is doing is he is rethinking the idea of the state in that period. So in a sense, I mean, I mentioned at the very outset, the key thinker on the military revolution isn't Michael Roberts, it isn't Geoffrey Parker. Both of them were much lesser scholars to the key thinker, which was Charles Tilley, which was the relationship between the rise of the state and the development of particular military systems. Now that one is looking at much more complex understandings of what the state meant, that one can actually put a big question mark against that. So if you're interested in theory, and I'm very interested in theory, one of our great problems is, I think, when we talk about the military revolution, we use a very small number of texts, and we also fail to ask a question, which is, I think, a very important one. I live in Exeter. If I was to go south 150 miles to France, and I was to sit down in a seminar of French scholars, they will say to me, what are you talking about? There is no military revolution. This is an English concept, or they might say an Anglo-Saxon concept, which is funny because most of the English are these days not Anglo-Saxon, or never were really. Or they might say it's an Anglo-American concept. It doesn't actually mean very much in French literature, and it doesn't mean very much in quite a few literatures in the world. So in a way, people haven't got their head round that, and they haven't got their head round the need to think through concepts that are supposed to be of global validity, but that much of the world doesn't really pay much attention to. So anyway, there's a little rant. But, you know, I do think we need to think about that. And Portuguese scholars are well placed to do that, because Portuguese scholars have a global range because of the global interactions of Portugal. It's reasonable to say, what does the military revolution mean if you're looking at it from the perspective not just of Portuguese warriors in India, but also of their opponents? That's
one of the, Jeremy's absolutely right, but one of the difficulties, in a sense, we've been praising you for trying to reach out to this global audience by publishing in English your results. And one of the ways you can hang your work on a hook which will grab an international English reading audience is particularly to hang it on the hook of the military revolution.
You're right. You're right.
And something Jeremy said earlier, the military revolution is all about action. And I think it's, you know, we could possibly say it's about fighting. And yet a lot of these armies, they exist in peacetime. We've got large communities. Armies are really enormous communities. And I think that one of the things we need to be doing is looking not so much at armies as fighting machines, but as just communities, overwhelmingly of men, and we apply to them the same questions we apply to other communities, things about crime and punishment, patterns of intimate relation, that sort of thing. And we just need to think of armies in rather different ways. So yeah, there's lots of possibilities here. But in a way, the military revolution is also problematic in that with Parker, we get this shift in a new direction. So Parker's hanging on it, this whole idea of the relationship between Europe and the outside world. So the military revolution isn't quite what it was when Roberts formulated it. It's just got this whole new complicated baggage.
Yes, I think that's a very...
Okay, some interference. Well, thank you very much.
Can you?
Yes, we can hear you.
I am?
Yes, we can hear you. There is a little bit of noise coming, but we can hear you. Please, go ahead.
Well, it's two words from the youngest member of the youngest collaborator of the three editors. It was a pleasure to make this chapter and supporting your initiative since the meeting in Évora. And I wrote a kind of text that is probably not very appealing, because I was strictly moved by the answer to the question: was a military revolution in Portugal, mainly in Portugal. So it is probably not very appealing because it has a lot of numbers, and it's somehow replacing a few data from my 30 years of research about these issues. So it was a pleasure to participate in this adventure of trying to conquer a place in the English in the English imperium of science. That's all.
Excellent.
Well, thank you very much, Fernando. I happen to disagree with you in one thing. I do believe your chapter, it's quite important, not only because of the data, but also because of the data.
I also think so, but that doesn't mean it is not very appealing.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Fernando.
Can I ask a question? Do we lose sight of Portugal? That is, of the European territory.
Ah,
what?
Interesting point. Interesting point. Very interesting point.
I didn't understood.
Yeah, sorry. Do we? Your chapter is about Portugal, right? And I'm thinking in this preoccupation with interest in a global Portuguese empire, do we sometimes lose sight of Portugal itself? Portugal fights this near 30 years war in the middle of the 17th century. It intervenes in the War of the Spanish Succession. Has this war against Spain, 1762-63. You're talking about two states that they're trying hard. One of them's trying hard to lose. Both of them are trying hard to lose. Neither of them performs very well. And although we think Portugal does not very well, Spain doesn't do much better in the War of 1762-63.
No.
So are we neglecting Portugal itself?
Yes. I wrote it many years ago in English.
Can I just very quickly say something, just a very simple point about the War of 1762. The War of 1762 is a classic example of a strategically asymmetrical war, in that Portugal does not need, for that war, to conquer any aspect of Spain or to campaign successfully into Spanish territory. There's a basic strategic asymmetry there in terms of the needs of the two sides. And so the Portuguese plus their allies succeed by stopping their opponents. And I mean, I don't think one should see this necessarily as a Portuguese failure. It's always hard in a first campaign to immediately be fit for purpose. There are big logistical problems that year, but I think the Portuguese do better in 1762 than they're sometimes credited for.
Yes, they do amazingly well.
Yes.
But what we usually call Spain, in that period, it's very weak. And that proves constantly that we have the idea that we have a war between a small country and a great power, but that is not true. The great power, it's over. It's over. And if we compare the sizes of the two armies in presence, they are similar.
Yes.
Never the Spanish could move a large number of troops that would completely decide a confrontation.
Yes.
And in the naval action, they don't have any ability to make a campaign. So that was that explains the astonishment in Europe when the Portuguese win this war, because no one expected it.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, if I may just say one thing to Professor.
Go ahead.
To Professor Storrs' comment, we tried to make sure that there was a balance in the volume between Portuguese European history and the history of the Portuguese Empire. I can tell you that there's a feeling. It is certainly the case. It is our experience that it's much easier to attract attention from international historians if you talk about the Portuguese Empire than if you talk about Portuguese military history in Europe. In practical terms, in very practical questions in terms of getting an article in a journal, getting a paper accepted in a Congress, it's much easier to do it if you talk about the empire than if you talk about war, even with the Spanish monarchy. That's our experience, okay? And there are a lot more people abroad studying the Portuguese Empire than studying the Portuguese War with Spain. That's our feeling, again.
A very practical concern.
Yeah. Inevitably.
Sorry, I hope you don't mind me throwing another interesting question in. Look, in the late 18th century, Spain, for example, puts a great deal of energy and resources into becoming again, or in quite a new way, a naval power. And I'm just wondering, thinking about Portugal's empire, to what extent in the 18th century, particularly in the second half, are there efforts to mobilize the resources of empire into creating a navy of considerable force, which will ensure imperial communications and give it some sort of clout in Europe more generally?
The 18th century is no man's land.
Oh no, we're not interested in the 18th century.
No, we are interested. I don't know if there's none of the actors actually knows a lot about the 18th century. I don't know if Professor Fernando dos Costa wants to venture a reply to that. I don't know if he hears it, if he's still with us. Okay.
In the late years of 18th century, Rodrigo de Sousa Coutinho, Minister of Marine and Foreign Affairs, tries to make a reform of Navy, but it's short and not a very successful initiative. But we can find there the project of becoming more autonomous face the English protection of the Portuguese trade in the Atlantic. No.
Can I maybe throw something else into the
Yes, please.
So
please, Zoltán, yes.
I suppose largely the critique of the whole idea of military revolution goes through saying that there is no revolution, right? But it seems to me that partly, in not being a specialist, this is actually more of a question than a comment, is how about the other word in the concept, which is the military? Is that perhaps where is that where you're suggesting, or where we might suggest that a significant part of the critique and perhaps also a significant part of the perspective for future research lies in rethinking what we actually mean by the military for a society as complex as the Portuguese imperial societies really before 1800, for example. So the military seems to me to include many different aspects, some contradictory. Sometimes there is a lack of manpower. So in the there are many examples of where actually citizens who are not meant to be fighters have to fight. This is very prominent in the Asian cities of the Estado da Índia, sometimes elsewhere. On the other hand, as was mentioned already, sometimes troops are just stationed and never go out to fight, right? And that too is a really important aspect to have that visibility. The Spanish garrison in Lisbon, for example, during the Union of Crowns, or Portuguese troops stationed near Asian kings as a sign that, you know, the king might be protected by the Portuguese, even though they don't really fight. And of course, for half of the year, you can't do anything anyway, right? So they are often demobilized and they just have to roam around and try to find something to eat. So there are these very, very contradictory, very different aspects that we seem to be putting under the umbrella of the military. And I'm not sure if that the implication might be that this is one way forward. So really the question is to the specialists in military history, if this is one thing to consider.
Well, of course, I do think there's a tremendous value in analyzing different angles of military activity. And in this case, you are absolutely correct when you mention the case for military labor, for instance, which is very, very important. Not only the case of Portuguese troops, but also the case of integration of non-Portuguese, non-European troops, for instance. One thing that usually André Murteira says, and he's very right when he says that, is that today in the historiography, especially for that period pre-1800 and even after 1800, we know very little about the men, about the recruitment process, and that is certainly one of the directions where you're going to see some work being done in future years. Military labor, I would definitely say that. Other aspects are the ones that, for instance, Professor Christopher Storrs already mentioned, provisions, shipping. There is also some work being made on privateers right now by the Portuguese historiography. We need more, definitely. But yes, I do agree with you. I'm not sure if my co-authors want also to put in some comments. André, Roger?
No, just a few basic things. Then the problem, Professor Black has already mentioned that military history still relies too much on the operational history, traditional narrative operational history. So it seems like we're always one step behind the others when we do military history. So I totally agree with, for instance, with what Professor Christopher Storrs says. I mean, we have to look at the army as a community, not as this separate entity. So, but sometimes I get the feeling that we're one step behind the others. So, but that's where we need to go, obviously.
Well, I'll just say that for me the big question and that relate with these matters is practically how could Portugal, maintain a war on the other side of the world? And we're saying on the logistical aspects, on the supply, of course, on the labor aspects. So we have a quite big structure that honestly, we don't really have much. We have some sources, some scarce sources, but we really don't know how it operated. So how men were being, I'm missing the word, of course, but that's the big question. And so we need to do, and my co-authors, my co-editors know that I'm always saying that we need a Spanish road, but a Portuguese maritime road, So that's because that's the same question, how can you maintain, because you have, and in the first years, in the first decades, the Portuguese were getting everything to India, from firepower, from everything, woods to build ships and everything. So it's quite a big operation, and there's still a lot to do, not only to Asia, but even to North Africa. How was everything being maintained from Portugal, and of course, and then we go to Brazil and everything. So there's a huge empire, and we actually really don't know how things were being maintained. And so I totally agree in what Professor Storrs were saying at the beginning about the provision and supply. I think it's a really big issue and a really big question mark on the Portuguese military side.
And we need to ourselves with the Dutch Republic and with Denmark, because just as Professor Storrs and Professor Black mentioned, because they're small European states with large overseas empires. Okay, so that's what
they held on to, and ones they held on to. I mean, this was a tremendous achievement, and again shows the fitness for purpose element. No, I mean, I agree with that comment about that you were making about the extent to which, I mean, it's almost as if the war and society, which was the other major concept that was advanced roughly contemporaneously with military revolution. And again, I think it would be useful for people, maybe you yourselves, to write a thought piece in which you drew these two together and thought about their interaction. But war and society served into a degree, I mean, it was an important argument, but it served to a degree to take the equation out by focusing on a sort of feeling that had been almost done by asserting it. It's almost as if by asserting that war and society was important, people then didn't necessarily need to do the archival work on it. And I find that, I mean, obviously there are exceptions. We can all think of exceptions. And the third concept, if you're looking for concepts that, again, all of them are ones which are still important, and again, possibly just need, I mean, you might feel that they're still very valuable, in which case, great, go on using them, or you might feel they need tweaking. The third one was face of battle. Now, again, face of battle made some important points when it came out. It argued fundamentally that people fought because of the group that they were members of, often the very specific, very local group of soldiers, local, the small unit of soldiers. That comradeship was what often took them forward, a fear of shame, that ordinary soldiers had that fear of shame. And it argued that people should focus on this experience of conflict rather than the generally moving pieces around on the board approach to it. And again, that was very useful in its time, but it ended up by telling us what we actually now all know, that some people enjoyed it, some people hated it, that people largely fought because their mates were fighting alongside them, that the experience of war is horrible. Well, we know all that. And again, it sort of got a bit exhausted. And I just think that in all of these areas, there is room for your generation to devise a new vocabulary, a new set of ideas, which may be ones in which you just call it Military Revolution Part 2 or Stage 2 or however you want to use it, or you might think of a different way to conceptualize it. But I just think it is time for all of these to be thinking maybe we need to have some new ideas out there, some new words, some new concepts. There you go, I'm being the radical. Now there you go. Surrounded by this mass of conservatives, you see, I'm the radical. There we go. But I just say that simply because that helps to make the excitement. Your collection is exciting. It's exciting because most people, apart from your good selves know it all about it already. But for anybody else reading it, it's exciting because they don't. I mean, when I read these essays, I thought, wow. I thought these were really exciting. Now, what you need to go on is to keep the excitement of your scholarship. And one of the ways to do that is not to write your next pieces of work or the current ones simply as another stage of what you've just done, however valuable that can be. You often need to intellectually leap forward and think about how it can move. So, let me embarrass Chris Storrs by saying one of the marvelous things he's done is be able to move between the very different societies of political cultures, political societies of Spain and Savoy, Piedmont, and between those of the 17th and the 18th century, which in the Mediterranean, particularly the Western Mediterranean, was very, very different. And I think that makes it much more exciting, whereas I think it's actually quite dull as a historian if you essentially write footnotes on your own work. Not that I think any of you will do that, but you're clearly a very bright group. And I think that to start to say, on the basis of Portugal, we can offer a new language for thinking about early modern military history, I think that's a very exciting proposition.
It would be a sort of doing a sort of Brodel for the world. So you write a history of Portugal, which is really a history of the world and the universe.
That's an idea.
But actually, I was thinking about radical approaches. What about the rise of the West? One of the things that occurred to me was that as we go on and the balance of power and wealth in the world shifts, does the rise of the West become something of ever sort of less importance, so that we no longer think about things in terms of how they explain the rise of the West? That rise of the West is a much more short-lived and less important thing, whatever we understand that rise of the West to mean.
Yes, that's a very good point. That's actually a very good point. And, one of the reasons, as you will know, one of my great bugbears, you can say I'm wrong, and I'm quite happy about that. One of my great bugbears about the global revolution theory was that in 1800, even more 1750, but in 1800, quite a lot of where the world's population was, the actual impact of Western power was not as clear-cut as the timetable a military revolution would suggest. And indeed, in some respects, obviously, if you're looking at China, for example, the 1830s onwards is the key period, not what has happened up to the 1830s. And, the statistics that are given about how much of the world's world's area is under European control, well, a lot of that is North Asia, Siberia, and claims to territory in North America. But, if you actually had a population skewed map of the world, and in other words, an equal population cartogram, there you go, there's a map thing for you. If you were using an equal population cartogram for 1800, but even more 1750, you'd be struck at how limited the European military impact has been. Now, that doesn't mean they're failures, because they're not sitting out to conquer the world. And in fact, when people like, when Napoleon turns up in Egypt in 1798, thinking he can be the new Alexander the Great, he's clearly crackers. I mean, he's clearly mad. That notion, and it's a pretty bizarre idea even today that Napoleon thought he could do that, march all the way to India. But to me, what's interesting here is in part the question of periodization, and maybe it is the case that, as Chris says, in a world in which Europe, and by Europe I'm including Britain, Europe is in a more parlous condition, where East Asia is more prominent. Maybe some of our organization of chronological periods needs rethinking. I think that's a one to say. And secondly, maybe our discussion of modernity needs rethinking, because the military revolution, one of the things we haven't really talked about is the military revolution as an idea grew up in part in order to explain the turning point into modernity and to give it a military facet. Now, that's an interesting idea, and there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, you could argue it's not at all original, because that idea had been there ever since people started talking about gunpowder bringing down castle walls. So you could just say it was another version of a very traditional idea. But leaving aside that point, and others will have a different view on that, although I think I can substantiate that, now that we're in the 21st century, maybe modernity as a concept beginning in the early 16th, late 15th century doesn't look so secure. So maybe the idea of military revolution as cause and consequence of modernity, or the onset of modernity, can be at least problematized. Now, again, that sounds very theoretical, and many people who are interested in war in terms of fighting, they probably think, why doesn't this idiot go off and go away? But I do think that these theories are interesting, because I do think that there's a subliminal way in which we are all talking about different narratives and analyses of modernization. Partly how they look different in contrasting locations, partly how they look different, though, from very different chronological viewpoints. And I'm not sure that that doesn't mean that you can't again use the term military revolution, but maybe post-date it, maybe post-date military revolution to the period roughly 1860 to 1950, for example, if you wanted to talk about fundamental changes in the technology and contextualization of war. Maybe maybe we could tweak that. But you might argue, in other words, that the period of the conventional military revolution is another iteration of this long centuries beforehand, in which there'd been relationships between firepower and mobility. Those relationships had changed. They'd never been a constant, that the key difference in the period we're talking about is not gunpowder, which after all wasn't new then anyway. The key difference is global power projection through navies, and that those did change dramatically, and that's why Portugal is so absolutely fundamental. But then it actually then stabilized and didn't change again till you have the impact of steam power in the 19th century. So that we have as it were, an early precursor in the late 15th, 16th century of what is to then come again in the late 19th century, because although steam power in ships is earlier, it takes a while before you get ships that are totally reliant on steam, and of course before you get the reliance on iron. And all the coaling stations and the new geopolitics, the global trading system, etc., is very different with the kind of ships of the late 19th century. So maybe we just need to be rethinking the chronology if we wish to use the notion of military revolution as a causative account. Anyway, there again is another. I'm going to get into trouble in a second if I don't go away and attend to my domestic duties. So I have to
before you go, Jeremy, your periodization there, it fits in with what the project Peter Wilson's doing at Oxford at the moment on fiscal military, which goes down to the middle of the 19th century and sees that as some sort of terminal point in their notion of urban fiscal military hubs. But navies seem to lose out a little bit in the military revolution, although Geoffrey Parker has introduced them because Roberts didn't. It still seems to me that the military revolution is, and thinking about Zoltán's earlier point, military tends to mean miles, milites, and it's about soldiers. Whereas we need to sometimes introduce that word naval. And navies are phenomenally expensive.
Yes.
You know, they are a remarkable investment by the state or whoever it's dealing with. And it's just incredible. We tend to lose sight of the navies and the cost that they involve.
Yeah. Now, can I just say, do forgive me for going, but what I'd like to say to, I mean, Chris and I, you know, Chris can be bored silly listening to me because he can't escape my emails. But what I'd like to say, it's true. What I'd like to say to others, this has been an enormous pleasure. I hope we can sustain, you know, don't stop because I'm going. I hope we can sustain this relationship. I would be delighted to meet in person. And I think you've done a fantastic job. And I think, you know, very much hope you can take it forward to advance the subject as a whole, because although Portugal is important in its own right, it also has a much greater significance, both in the period you're talking about and for things we can learn about it in other periods. So, greetings from a wet, cold, miserable and grey Exeter. Thank you very much.
It sounds like Dundee.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Hi, Jeremy.
Well, so André, would you say something, please? No.
No.
Okay. Sorry, Professor Christopher Storrs, you were saying something?
Well, I guess I'll have to go before too long. But the other thing that interests me, I mean, your book has got two concepts at its heart. One is the military revolution, but the other is the rise of the West. And so sorry, I'm inviting somebody to sort of come in and think about, because we focus very much on the military revolution hitherto, but what about the rise of the West? I mean, Jeremy was just saying a number of interesting things there, but do you think that the concept of the military revolution would survive if it wasn't closely tied up with the idea of the rise of the West? Do you think it would survive as a useful tool for historical interpretation if it wasn't so closely allied as it is under Geoffrey Parker's version with the military revolution, with the rise of the West?
If I may.
Yeah, sure. You can start.
I think you're probably right. I think one of the main reasons why Geoffrey Parker almost resuscitated the military revolution thesis in the 80s, because when it first came up with the 50s with Michael Roper, which is basically a tool to explain the growth of the state, or the absolute state, as people called them back at the time. And when Geoffrey Roper expanded that idea and used it as a tool to explain the rise of the West, Western military exceptionalism. I think it explains a lot of the popularity and of the concept since then. I'm pretty sure if it remained as if it repeated the basic idea of Michael Roberts only, the way of explaining the growth of absolutism, it would probably died out, because it's not as sexy a subject, if I may say so. So the rise of the West, and despite what Professor Jeremy Black says, I believe it's gonna, people are still going to be talking about it for the following decades. With the issue of whether there was a Western military exceptionalism, whether there is the rise of the West, the cases behind it. I think despite China's growth, and we all know about that, I think in the following decades, people are going to still talking about that. People are going to still talk about that.
Yes, I do agree with that also as well. I believe he was quite clever, let us put it this way, into associating the rise of the West, especially in a moment where I believe the debate in other subjects about differences between the West, the East, and let's say, for instance, the debate of the economic divergence, the debate of little divergence, the great divergence by Pomeranz hadn't started. I mean, the book, you had the book of Pomeranz in 2000, and you have some articles in the 90s. You have, but the great debate about those topics, which is also discussion in a way about the West and the rest in terms of economic development, started a little bit later. So I guess he was, yes, I guess he did the right thing in associating the two topics. Roger?
No, I totally agree. I think it's the West is what maintain the fame of the book and the interest, mostly because from all the rise of the fiscal state and everything, it took care on the construction and the empire buildings, European buildings, and everything. And so I really think I agree that if we rip off the book from the rise of the West, it's very difficult to maintain any kind of interest on the idea of the military revolution abroad. And I think that we have several articles in the book that shows that. Beside mine, of course, we have André that shows all the issue about the Portuguese-Dutch rivalry. We have also Tristan article about the case of Macassar, and so and of course Baron and Tonio Andrade, and so I think it gives a great deal about this idea, of course, of the military revolution, but very close about the rise of the West. And so I think it's almost impossible today to separate these two issues. And I must agree with André. We're kind of, everybody's tired of the idea of military revolution, but I think it's very difficult to us to give it up.
Well, it's interesting because a moment ago you referred to some other new direction that this has been taken in, fiscal military, and I'm just, one of the things that interests me is how far this has really taken off in Portugal. Are people in Portugal picked up this concept and is there worked on it? Do people more or less think that the Portuguese state, and I'm thinking very much of the independent state that emerges out of the War of Restoration, is very clearly a fiscal military state?
Well, I can say it's hard to say. You know, it's hard to provide a definite answer to that. There were some studies done on the military way, on the military perspective, I would say. Some of them even by Fernando Costa. But in what concerns exactly the study, for instance, of taxation, fiscal system, development fiscal system, I think that there are some minor studies, minor articles and books, but there is an important project right now, which is dealing with fiscal system and credit, public credit. Project headed by Leonor Frei Costa in the University of Lisbon, which I think it goes throughout all early modern period, and I think it's going to bring novelties and some extra, extra material to this, because they are doing thorough research throughout all archives, and I think it's going to provide a great deal of new outputs and material to work.
That's interesting.
Yes, we're all very excited here in Portugal with that perspective. I'm not sure if there is anyone else who wants to add to this discussion. Fernando, yes, please. The mic, please. Microphone, sorry.
There is no clear connection between war and fiscal innovation during the 18th century. It's not quite clear. The innovation in Portugal.
In Portugal.
Yes, there are a few new taxes created during the periods of war, but they are not crucial in the system. In the second half of the 18th century, it's a bit different because there is a tax that is maintained after the war. So it's different from the other experience in the beginning of the century and in the 17th century. But it's not clear a connection between war and we have to realize that war in Portugal is something that occurs 50 during with the intervals of 50 years. So it's not a structural as in other places of Europe.
Right. Okay. But anyway, so there's some interesting work being done on the fiscal military state, which we can relate to the military revolution, I think, and it's one of the new directions in which research is going as a sort of offshoot of a lot of the military revolution material. I'm not sure if you have anybody else, or are people disappearing as we speak?
Yeah.
Yes, I guess, yes, if there are no questions or comments, I'm going to thank you all for being with us today, this late afternoon, and also mention that 7 days from now, day 28, we're going to have also another session, but this time in Portuguese. You're all invited, of course.
So if I want to improve my Portuguese,
of course, definitely. You should come, definitely.
It can only get better.
Okay.
But then, okay, so before I go, thank you very much. It's been very interesting, and the book is very interesting. And as I've made this point a number of times during this session, it's really interesting to get this insight into some really interesting work being done by young Portuguese historians. And I shall have my students reading it, so it will improve their understanding of Portuguese in the Atlantic, which is one of our courses. But anyway, thank you all, and thank you all those people who were attending but didn't speak. So goodbye, and look after yourselves.
Thank you very much, Professor. Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye to you all.